Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weber. In this episode, I'm joined by two very influential voices in college athletics today. Dr. Gerard Bradley, the University of Louisville's 20th president, and Dr. Larry Benz, the board chair at the University of Louisville's trustees. Jerry previously served Louisville as executive vice president and university provost, so he's risen up through the ranks. Larry has served on the board of trustees since 2011, and you also serve on the University of Louisville's Athletic Association Board of Directors and the President's Council. Jerry and Larry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you,
Thank
Karen.
you. Thank you, Karen. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you both. So let's start with something that was a very recent occurrence in your finalization of your budget for next year. Your Athletic Director Josh Heird, who I know you think very highly of, and the three of you work very well together. The three of you authored a white paper influencing the national conversation and discussion around the state of affairs in Division I. And while you put that out there, your AP was very clear to your board that if you stop spending in this arms race now, you lose. So Jerry, start us back with the idea of the white paper and take us up through where Louisville is today in the landscape.
Yeah, sure. Well, to talk about the white paper first, I think actually the genesis came around all of the conversations that, Larry and Josh and I were having around every day, a new thing we were learning about what was going on. What thought was, sort of disorder became more disordered as the year went by. And I think as a result of all of the disruption that was going on, and the lack of leadership that we were seeing, quite honestly, from, I would say, the four commissioners. There was not really a centralized theme around all of the issues. Like, people would talk about, the issue of eligibility. They would talk about, the spending cap. They would talk about revenue enhancement, but they were all separate conversations. And I think as Larry and I and Josh were talking through all these issues, one day I get a text from Larry and he says, you know what, it's time for an update. And, sure enough, Larry started us on the journey and, essentially produced a draft, which, I thought we would probably, knock out in a couple of days. And, quite honestly, it took us maybe about 3.5 to 4 weeks to get it done because we just kept going back and forth with it. And, we would modify it and edit it. And really what we wanted to do was to get a complete picture. We weren't trying to state all the answers to the problems. We're not pretending to be super smart or that we were super smart in identifying all these issues. I think everybody had talked about them, but we just put them into, a series of articles that, we published that really highlighted where we thought was the next directions. And again, I think it was part of our reaction to the fact that we didn't hear a unifying voice out there. At the time, the SCORE Act had been promised to pass it, every week. It seemed like it was going to go, and that seemed to get bogged down in partisan politics in the House. And really, it looked dead, quite honestly. And then, we knew that there was some activity going on in the Senate. We certainly wanted to be a voice to encourage that. And I think that's really the genesis of the white paper. And quickly to Josh's comment, I think everybody's in this situation, right? We don't want to be left behind because, it's a performance-based model economically. So, if you want to bring in revenue, you've got to invest. You've got to invest in your players, in the different conferences and that produce money. And we really wanted to, stay in the game, no pun intended. We wanted to make sure we have great coaches, we've got great culture, we've got a great reputation. And we just wanted to keep doing this, as long as we can, as long as it's sustainable. But I think the white paper was to say, this is not sustainable. We can't do this indefinitely. Nobody can. And that's what it was a call to action. And I think, Josh's comments reflect the reality of all of it right now. We're all trying to stay in the game.
And it must have been some relief to Josh that you were recognizing that, because I've talked with athletic directors who feel like their presidents don't get it. They just keep saying, find more money, hire better coaches, create a better culture. And yet what you're saying is,
we do Josh all of those things too.
Okay. Okay, check the box. All right. But at some point, you have to say the system is not working the way it is. And that's what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Exactly.
great. Yeah. Okay. So I know you've done a lot of conversations nationally. I did see your board conversation at the night commission. How was it received, Jerry?
It was very well received. We thought, I mean, we went and, I had never been before the night commission. And again, as I mentioned, this was a steep learning curve for me, as you mentioned correctly. Being a provost, you're not really in the thick of it. And so when I came into this way, I had to learn a lot thanks to my colleagues I did. And it really was a great meeting. We had a lot of support around the table for the issues that we were bringing on. They came up with afterwards and thanked us for being there. And your point about being unified around it, the unusual scenario of having a board chair and an athletic director same time from the same school, speaking to the same issues. And I think, they were used to having a person from this university, maybe an athletic director from another university, maybe a co-chair from some other, but to have the three of us from the same institution kind of talking about the same issues and digging on the same thing. So I think it was pretty well received.
Good. Good.
Good.
Larry, let me shift to this somewhat unique oversight structure that the board has at Louisville. You are the chair of the board of trustees, but also a very key voice on the Athletic Association board of directors and the president's council. Walk us through how that impacts some of this decision making.
No, it's a very fair question. I think, you have to look at the role that as a trustee as a fiduciary obligation, first and foremost. And one of the things that you need at a university to really function effectively, at least on an area like athletics, that is, 9% of the budget, but 91% of the optics, is you need to have alignment between the president and the AD and the board chair.
Mhm.
It's been one of our frustrations, I think, is that what you tend to see is a lot of folks on the sidelines who are weighing in and bringing decisions, but you don't have those who are actually in the playing field. So this wasn't a solo act, but it was the idea that, we use the term inflection point, I think, or running out of the time is sort of the truer version. And sort of we led with both on that. And when we presented the white paper, we engaged our, athletic association in terms of being able to view it and weigh in on it right around the time we were getting ready to, publish it. Tremendous positive feedback around it. And, I think what they mostly respected is that a lot of people in our position wouldn't say things on the record. And, we decided to. The University of Louisville is interesting because it has a very true athletic association and one that we're really proud of. It is mostly from a board representation, mostly students, faculty, and staff. Which, if you think about the humble beginnings of athletics, that's who it's was originally for. And so we
Exactly.
want and we will continue to have, and we made a very conscious decision that we are going to continue to lead with EULA, with our athletic association. We have institutional control there. We have compliance there. We have, relationship with our faculty advisory rep, or our academic rep, and it functions very well for us. However, EULA doesn't have the fiduciary tension that the board of trustees has,
Okay.
which we owe to the university, its mission, its students, and its purpose. And so we have to have sort of the duty to the entity, but we also have to have an understanding of the capital infrastructure behind it. Those are not always the same thing. When you spin a piece of athletics into a separate vehicle, like we have either on the EULA side or now with Cardinal Ventures, those are decisions that lay at those layers. But the trustee is still the fiduciary in the public's eye, as it should be. But the information, the authority sometimes moves to rooms that all the trustees don't sit in. That's why you have an athletic association. That's why you have a nonprofit subsidiary like Cardinal Ventures, like we do.
I really appreciate you sharing that because I'm having a number of conversations with trustees around the country who are overwhelmed by how much they have to learn about college athletics. And in some ways, they may have paid attention on a very, high level, but now they realize that if they're going to do their fiduciary oversight, they really have to get into the weeds. So how do you relate to the board from the you call it the EULA back to there so they can execute their fiduciary responsibilities appropriately?
No, it's interesting because the University of Louisville Athletic Association, which is what I've been referring to as EULA, is it's an affiliate of the university at large. And so it's best thought of as the athletic department with some governance. It's where the coaches' contracts are at. It's where the decisions on hiring and firing of coaches are at. And so it has broad oversight of the athletic department under the direction of the athletic director, but more importantly, under the governance and the control and institutional control of the president, which is something that is regulatory, coming out of all the stuff that happened, the Clery Act and everything out of that. So you have to be mindful of the compliance requirements of it. And that's why it's so important to have a president that has that element of governance authority at both the EULA level, as Jerry is the chairman of that board, as well as at the university board, where he is beholden to the trustees and the board chair relative to oversight. So it's a healthy relationship that you have. And you're absolutely right. When you have a department that's $170 million and maybe 20 years ago was maybe $10 million in terms of the size of that department,
Yeah.
literally, these have become enterprises.
Yeah.
And what has to evolve out of those enterprises is the maturity of your board members, the education that goes into it, and all of the ebb and flow. And unfortunately, what's happened in athletics is it's gone through days and weeks where new changes are all the time, where you have
Mhm.
judges in a number of states, overruling the governing body of the NCAA, where you have the NCAA changing rules around eligibility, and you had the post-pandemic transfers issue and then transfer portal issues. And we wrote a specific paper about, at one point, student athlete actually meant something. The idea that you would have athletes that transfer and automatically are academically eligible was foreign to us just a short number of years ago.
Yeah.
Used to be that you could only transfer if you didn't graduate. You could only transfer to school if they didn't have your major. Look how far we've come since then.
Right.
And, and so all these rule changes
Yeah.
happening all the time. And it was in part why we wrote not only the white paper, but why we wrote subsequent perspectives, because it's an education process, and we certainly don't have the answers, but we're at least trying to put in context of the history and the pressure points that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I really applaud that. Jerry, from your perspective, how does it look when you report to the board versus the athletic association? I noticed that the athletic association has 29 seats on it, which seems large to me. So how do you navigate those two groups? I assume they all want to work together, but they've still got to be different.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Larry mentioned, EULA functions as really a voice for the campus. So, we've got faculty, we've deans, we've staff members. So all of our constituent groups, are around the table. And I think it's, again, what it should be, right? Because athletics is not a separate entity to the university. The athletics is as important and as functioning and as vital as any academic unit is. So to me, it's the part of the university that we have over 600 athletes, and everybody kind of keeps talking about that 5% that are getting all the money. But the reality is that, the vast majority of these students are here to get a college degree. It's a part of their academic journey. It's transformative, and it's our brand. It's an incredibly important part of who we stand for, what we mean to the impact of the community and the city. And I think having that broad group in EULA gives buy-in, right? Gives people the opportunity to be a part of it. I can't tell you how excited people are to get on that EULA board. There's a lot of people who want to get on that board because, it is something that is just so important to them, to the city. And, we have so many non-alumni who just look to us in the city because we do not have any professional basketball or football entity. So really the college experience, the college sports experience is so important to the culture of the city. When I deal with the board, I think clearly it's a different audience. It's a smaller group. We have 13 members of the board of trustees, but yet there is overlap there. There are some board members who are on EULA. So, in addition to Larry and myself, there are other board members. We have our constituent reps, both the staff, faculty, and students have representation on both groups. So there's quite a bit of overlap. So really, when I'm talking to one, I really feel like I'm telling the same story to the other. It's about highlighting the university. It's highlighting our student athletes as we would any other academic entity. And I think it works really well. Structure is very, very balanced. Larry was saying when it comes to evaluating the AD, it goes through EULA. The coaches, contracts all go through it. The approval of the budget, the workshop around the budget, all feeds through EULA. And then ultimately, of course, it's presented as part of the overall budget to the trustees. So you sort of have these checks and balances and overlap. And I think it works really seamlessly.
Yeah. I'm interested in this piece because I co-authored an op-ed in Inside Higher Ed about 2 months ago with my colleague here at Penn, Peter Eckel, and we wrote about the fact that more boards have got to get more better understanding of college athletics and all the changes, all the finances and everything. One of the things that we proposed, I'd love to get both of your reactions to this, was to actually have a board subcommittee. So the University of Louisville Athletics is not a subcommittee; it's a separate committee. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's distinctly separate. It's a separate a nonprofit 503c affiliate.
Okay. Okay. So we were advocating for a subcommittee on the board. I'm wondering if you have any reaction or just thoughts on how boards could structure themselves if they don't want to have a separate group like you have. Larry, you go first.
It's interesting. We've looked at a couple of models that have some analogies to what you're describing. So, for example, University of Kentucky, which does not have a distinct athletic association,
Right.
has a board committee, and it's the only board committee that is not appointed by the board chair. It's appointed by the president, and it consists of some board of trustees, and I think probably some community members as well. I'm not 100% certain on that. And I think the reason for that is the complexities around athletics. We chose not to go that route, but we did do something similar in the sense that we created a 5013C nonprofit affiliate of the university called Cardinal Ventures, which is trying to accomplish something similar, which is to not only monetize, but professionalize athletics. Like I said, these are enterprises now, these are not departments. And in order to do that, you better have a level of expertise that runs typically outside of an academic area. These are folks who are in the community doing marketing. These are folks who understand the legal implications around athletics, folks that understand the financial around ventures and funding companies. And you're really trying to be, we're a nonprofit, but we have to be incredibly entrepreneurial. And then we have to have the legal infrastructure around dealing with student athletes agents, which are almost all of them these days, and all the
Yes.
things that entails. And then the NIL itself, the relationship with vendors and those who are securing them and willing to compensate for services. That's a level of sophistication to, I think, what your larger point is of why either subcommittees or some structure that deals with the professionalization. Like our athletic director always says that college athletics was never meant to be a professional, enterprise or professional sport. It wasn't, but it is. And, we have allocated every, P1 university has allocated at least 20.5 million or going up to 21 or whatever to, rev share. That's coming directly out of the university. And then outside of that are all the workarounds around what is supposed to be name, image, and likeness. But what really has happened is it's really more pay for play.
Yeah, absolutely. Jerry, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Gary covered it. I do think that the model we have is better because I think EULA offers shared governance, right? I mean, because boards tend to be appointed by the governor. In our state, that's the way it is. In some states, they're elected elected from the community. But I think having this board, having faculty and staff, and student representation, an important decision-making point is really important. And yet we have the beauty of having a subset of the board, have members of the board, including then people who bring expertise to the table that wouldn't otherwise be there. So I think our tripartite way of doing this is actually, again, in my biased opinion, is a great way for us to be positioning ourselves as we look at the future ahead.
Yeah, makes sense. But we're all on such a fast learning curve right now, and it's really hard to plan too far ahead. But I think your paper was a call to action, and it sounds like Senator Maria Cantwell responded favorably to your call to action. In fact, in Yahoo Sports, Ross Dellinger wrote, in an effort to align their schools in opposition to the Protect College Sports Act, Cantwell accused the conference commissioners of the Big Ten and the SEC of intimidating members by threatening team scheduling changes, suggesting that league executives were treating university presidents and athletic directors as puppets. And she believes that school board members who want their institutions to support the bill are now springing into action. So basically, she's saying she thinks athletic directors and presidents are going to get their comeuppance from their boards who are suddenly saying, what the hell are you doing to send these letters opposing this bill Because it seems like everybody but the SEC and the Big Ten are kind of in favor with a broader con concept of revenue sharing. Larry, you're smiling. What do you think of
Well, first of all, I 110% agree with the senator. And having been on a number of calls with her, she is incredibly informed, passionate, educated, and gets to the heart of the key issues. And one of those key issues, it is the exact reason why a board chair, an athletic director, and a president came together to write a paper and that we are in alignment on. If you think about it, and you were a stakeholder that didn't know a lot about higher ed, you would think the commissioners are in charge of the presidents.
right?
Well, the reality is the commissioners answer to the presidents. The presidents answers to the chair of the board of trustees and their trustees. That's why they are empowered to hire and fire the president. What you see instead is that the presidents are running scared, particularly in the SEC and the Big Ten. Not all of them. Many of them have actually been part of the college saving sports group and mission. And I have a great deal of respect. And I also have a great deal of respect for, Cody Campbell and his group that said, look, let's get board chairs together and see where their heads are at around this, because right now the commissioners are running like they own it. If you look at the reason, it's simple. The average president life expectancy, particularly at public universities, is about 3 years. AD's life expectancy is in that same neighborhood. So that by the time a president, remember, athletics is 8-9% of their budget. When they onboard, they've got bigger fish to fry. By the time they get around athletics, the commissioners have run rampant with their agendas. And we are an institute that's got a mission around access and opportunity, and it's student driven around, creating, what the intention of college athletics is for us. But we got to get better alignment, and this comeuppance that she's referring to really is the combination of the boards, the president, the AD getting in alignment, and then driving then influencing the commissioner. That's where it's supposed to be at.
Yeah. Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Senator Cantwell. I mean, to Larry's point, nearly 70% of the Big Ten presidents have transitioned over the past 2 years. And actually in the ACC, I am nearly in the middle of the pack or even in the top half now, and I'm only 15 months to the job. And that gives the commissioners a lot of power
Yeah.
because, they are the ones driving the agendas of the meetings. And so as a new president coming in, you're finding your feet. You're not sure, where your colleagues are at. And that gives the commissioners a lot of leeway then kind of dictate. And I think quite honestly, their interests are not sometimes aligned with the common good. I mean, they're there for a reason, right? They have a function around what conference they have. In the case of the Big Ten and the SEC, they've got the lion's share of the revenues. And so
Yeah.
they're even least less inclined to want to share that. And we believe that this is not just about sharing their revenue. We're not interested in them having less money. What we're interested in is saving college sports and actually bringing, enhanced revenue opportunities that we think will come because of the Broadcasting Act optionality that is part of the capital cruise bill, and then the caps, and then about the transfers and all of those issues that are so vital if we're going to protect the sports. So I am completely supportive of the comments and the intent of both Senators Cantwell and Cruz. And it's just great to see a bipartisan effort around the legislation.
Jerry, have you, and I don't want you to share any confidences, but have you had conversations with presidents in those conferences to say, we agree, we need to broaden the revenue sharing model? Or is that really the sticking point?
No, I think there's agreement that, everybody wants to explore it more. I think where confusion comes in is that they're misinformed. A lot of misinformation or disinformation deliberately being put out there. I think we don't have all the answers, like we said, but, when you look at, the Premier League in England, you look at any conference over time when they've, kind of pooled those broadcasting, revenues, and they've been able to negotiate as one. Right now, you look at, college sports is, approximately $4 billion in media rights. And you look at, the NFL, north of 15 or 16, and the NBA somewhere around that 10 mark. And yet we have more eyes on us next to football, essentially. And yet we don't have, the same access to marketing and media revenue. So I think there's an opportunity there. And we have we have the responsibility to seek those opportunities as we build a sustainable model. Because everybody argues that players shouldn't be paid or get some return on what they have brought with the NIL changes in the settlement. But what we want is controls. We want equity. We want performance. Forward.
Larry, I want to ask you a question, and this is kind of looking backwards for a second, but I don't know if you remember last fall, the Big Ten had a proposal from the University of California pension system about an investment. I think it was 10% equity ownership, that type of thing. And there enough trustees and regents raised a holy heck about the whole thing that it didn't, at least hasn't gone through as of now. What do you think about the role that trustees should play when a conference commissioner brings that kind of proposal to the president, but doesn't involve the trustees?
So I think, eventually it has to go to the trustees anyhow. So I don't, I think they're trying to maybe circumvent some things. But look, the proposals coming to us are numerous. They estimate $2 billion plus in private capital. Based on the number of presentations that University of Louisville has received, I would say that it's more than that.
Yeah.
And we have to be always open and curious. In fact, we went the extra effort to create a dormant entity that could be activated by the trustees in case we get serious about it. And then it would take further approvals by the trustees and a lot more education. And the fundamental issue is the education that we're getting, is it outrunning, the bias of all of these kind of things? And the bias is amazing. Private equity has a fund to deploy. The bank has a fee. The consultant has a follow-up engagement. And even these studies have sponsors. You somewhat alluded to the FTI analysis arguing against the media rights pooling was
Right.
commissioned by the very two conferences that benefit from the most by it being,
Right.
status quo. So the case for private capital is very real. It fills a genuine operating deficit and brings revenue expertise, but the salesman rarely has, at least at this stage, the right teacher. But we're hoping and believing over time it'll mature and become more professionalized. Just a few years ago, the students, athletes didn't have agents, and then they had agents that were incredibly unsophisticated with no criteria or no expertise. I can tell you that the University of Louisville, particularly in its men's football and basketball, tends to now deal with agents that are very professionalized. And thankfully, the fees somewhat have gone down because of that. And that looks like it might end up being regulated. And I hope that it does. We see the same thing evolving in banking and private capital. And it's a learning process, and it is iterative and educational and informative. We are not ready for that at the University of Louisville. I know University of Utah and others are looking at it. We aren't there. Doesn't mean we won't get there, because again, you have to be open and curious. We've already said college sports has already been professionalized as an enterprise, and every enterprise I know, whether it be the NFL, NBA, or others, has a capital structure and a stack of debt and other things that allow it to flourish. And we have to be open to that in the future.
Jerry, I'm wondering, as you're now in your 15th month, I mean, has this been like drinking from a fire hose, just learning about private equity and all these things?
Yeah, it's been a huge learning curve. I think all of us have been in that journey, and it's been extraordinary. I mean, it really has been extraordinary. But it's amazing the power of people coming together. Because as Larry mentioned, we've been on a lot of calls now. Meeting, talking to smart people. Who are all trying to figure out solutions to it. And what amazes me, the commitment that some of these folks, particularly like these trustees who in general are volunteers, they've been asked to, have a responsibility, and just the workload, the effort that they're putting in right now to try to drive action, to really move the political process forward. And because many of these trustees are connected individuals, with politicians, that's been really crucial to see that. And I've learned a lot. It just reinforces your whole beliefs around relationships. That it takes a village to raise a child, and it certainly takes a village to solve this problem.
Yeah.
Because for Congress to act takes an act of supreme magnitude to make them get into a space where there's not unanimity ahead of time, or where there's not a convergence of support. And clearly this has been a different process, right? I mean, it's kind of been brought by, the constant advocacy, I would say, by people across the country. And I think most people out there really want to safeguard sports and to make it better. And I think that to me has been a great learning opportunity for me.
It strikes me how unified Senator Cruz and Senator Cantwell are on this too, because they both see the damage that could be done. with institutions in their own states if they're not part of the big two. And they've been very artful, I think, in explaining that, particularly Senator Cruz, because he's got a ton of Division One programs in
Yes.
Texas that are not they're not in the SEC or the Big
Yeah.
12. So I appreciate him advocating for that. I think that's really, really good. To kind of wrap up our conversation, what should trustees and presidents be thinking about next? What do you focus on, and what kinds of things over the next 3 to 6 months will you be kind of paying attention to? And Jerry, I'll start with you.
No, I think building a sustainable model. What happens if X happens? What happens if Y happens? Sort of this scenario planning. And I think a lot of what we're doing right now is trying to think ahead. How do we prepare ourselves to take advantage of what maybe levers that we might have going forward with even the legislation that hopefully will come for the Senate in the next couple of days, 2 weeks. Are we going to be ready for that? Are we having conversations with people now about setting up the right structure? What happens if it doesn't happen? What is our plan B or plan C? So I think we're all looking forward, right, and thinking about scenarios and options. But I think that's what we have to do. If we have a fiduciary responsibility, we've made it very clear that there is. We are not damaging the University of Louisville's core fundamental mission around education to all units. So, we've got to be thinking about what are the what are the triggers that have to happen if we have to do something different. So we're spending a lot of time thinking through that, looking at it, but also being out there, the strong advocate for really the solution. We believe the solution is in front of us now with more clarity than we've ever had before. So it's time to keep the fight, support this current legislative action in the Senate and get it into the House and then fight there to make sure we get some agreed legislation passed on this.
Yeah, yeah. And Larry, let me just add to that. I am asking the same question to you, but also, what if things don't change in Congress? What happens then?
And that's the scenario or game theory that we have to consider. And I'll start with Jerry's very well thoughtful explanation, and he ended with, which is particularly we have to seek advocacy. We have to call on our trustees and our constituents at the University of Louisville, all of our stakeholders, to be part of the political process. Write letters, advocate for what you support. It is critical, especially right now when we have such an important vote pending on the Senate floor. I'd say second, we have to have, to your last question, all the things around game theory and scenario planning. You see some states, like the state of Wisconsin, has actually got money from their state legislature going to the University of Wisconsin.
I saw
I'm not
that.
saying
Yeah.
that's a solution, but it's a good example of scenario planning. We made a decision at U of L a couple of years ago. We effectively did a biannual budget. The first year we had a student fee we added, and we added a lot of support from the university financially. We said year two, we'll continue with the student fee, and ours is still relatively low compared to everybody, whether you're private or public school, but we're not going to take $1 out of general funds. If you do, you're taking $1 out of a scholarship, out of research, out of potential benefits and faculty raises and staff raises. So we're not going to do that, but that's unsustainable. And so when you get to year three, where do we have to make the right cuts if nothing happens? Are there other forms of financing that we have to consider? Are there avenues within the state legislature or even the city? Because we contribute about $1.3 billion to the local economy through our athletic programs. The athletic model has always been subsidized, even when athletic programs were roughly break even. It's always been a myth to me that this idea of self-sustaining in athletics has ever been around, because you can't point to more than a handful of schools over a handful number of years that were ever able to really successfully
right.
do that.
Yeah.
There has always been support from the universities, institutional support around it, but it's funny to hear that. Now that subsidy model has been 2x'd because we have revenue share and we have the professional enterprise component of it. And at Louisville, we have two sports that make money: men's basketball and football. They support, our other 20 plus sports and 600 plus student athletes. We also have all the functions within it, student supports. Our academic GPA has been outstanding. All the things with our graduation rate at 92% and otherwise. What can we sustain under a model that we will not take general funds dollars out of, but how can we be competitive? Because the economics say that if you're not competitive, you have no chance of making additional revenues without it. It's reason number one of our three reasons of how to save this. One, we have to have optionality around SBA. Second, we have to have better governance around it. And third, we have to have a hard spending cap around NIL and all the workarounds that go with it, because it's just not, I don't even call it an unsustainable model anymore. I call it the theater of absurdity, which I've said publicly because I really do believe it. It's not anything that ever makes sense in a capitalist or otherwise society where you can where you get to a point where you can subsidize losses.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll go back to the comment Josh Heird made in the beginning. If you stop spending now, you lose. And that just seems absurd.
It really is. Yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you both for taking time. I know you have a tremendously busy schedule, and this is an important conversation for my students to hear, as well as the other folks who tune into the podcast. So thank you both very, very much.
You're welcome, and appreciate all the great work you do.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Fun.
Thank you.